The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge above the ER bay at Cedar Creek Medical, that particular frequency that made your molars ache after 12 hours straight. Elena Martinez didn't notice anymore. She'd stopped noticing fluorescent hum somewhere between Ramadi and the drive to Savannah 3 years ago, back when noticing things could get you killed. Now she just worked. The 4 needle slid into the subclavian vein of a dehydrated Marine, smooth, blind insertion, no hesitation, no ultrasound needed. Her fingers moved like they were reading Braille on the man's collarbone, finding the anatomical landmarks with the kind of precision that came from inserting lines in the dark, in sandstorms, in the back of a Black Hawk with rounds cracking through the fuselage. The Marine sergeant barely flinched. She was already moving to his next vital, her dark hair pulled so tight it looked like it hurt, her scrubs pressed with the kind of discipline that suggested her real job involved more than blood pressure cuffs and charting. Dr. Marcus Mercer stood at the nurse's station watching her work, his grey hair immaculate, his white coat starched until it could cut, his eyes narrowing in that particular way that meant he was calculating something. He was 56 years old, had been chief of emergency medicine at Cedar Creek for 9 years, and had the kind of face that suggested he'd never experienced surprise or doubt. He was wrong about a lot of things. Elena Martinez was the first thing he was catastrophically, fatally wrong about, and he had no idea yet. What he saw was a nurse with steady hands placing and 4 in a dehydrated Marine with unremarkable efficiency. What he didn't see, what his brain had no framework to process, was the way her fingers found the subclavian access point without hesitation, the same blind insertion technique taught only to forward surgical teams embedded with Marine units. He didn't see it because seeing it would require admitting that the ER nurse he'd been noticing for 8 months had credentials that made his medical degree look like a high school diploma. His ego had no room for that geometry. Elena moved through her rounds with invisible precision, checking vitals on the post-surgery Marine sergeant whose knee surgery had gone clean at 0800 that morning. Her touch was gentle on his bandaged shoulder, the kind of gentleness that came from having held too many people at the moment their bodies stopped working. The sergeant was about 30, dark eyes alert despite the morphine drip, the kind of military bearing that didn't come off even when you were wearing a hospital gown and your leg was wrapped in compression bandaging. His name was Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Vega, and he'd taken shrapnel in Helmand Province for years ago. He knew what military medicine looked like. He was starting to wonder if he was looking at it right now. Elena adjusted his pain medication, a precise calculation, not more than needed, calculated to the 10th of a milligram, and didn't wait for Mercer's approval before pushing it through the 4 line. She'd learned a long time ago that asking permission for correct medical decisions was a waste of everyone's time. Decisions that kept people alive didn't require administrative blessing. Dr. Mercer noticed. Of course he noticed. Noticing was his primary skill, though he mistook it for intelligence. He walked over to Elena's station with the kind of unhurried stride that communicated absolute authority, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a symbol of office. The ER was running at 93% capacity, 3 patients waiting in the hallway, 2 ambulances inbound, but Mercer had time for this. He always had time for this. "Ms. Martinez," he said, his voice the color of mahogany and money, the kind of voice that had been refined in country clubs and Ivy League hallways, "I prefer nurses consult me before medication adjustments. We maintain proper hierarchy here." The words landed with the weight he intended. The room didn't go silent, too much beeping and ventilator hum for that, but Elena felt the temperature shift anyway. 2 other nurses looked up from their stations. Mercer stood with his hands in his white coat pockets, the picture of institutional power, waiting for the apology that should come next. Elena nodded once, her jaw tightening fractionally, a movement so small that only someone trained to read human micro-expressions would catch it. She returned to charting without another word, her fingers moving across the electronic tablet with the same precision she'd used on that 4 line. No apology. No defensive explanation. No nervous laugh to diffuse the tension. Just acknowledgement and return to work. Mercer waited for 3 seconds, she counted them, the same way she counted rounds of ammunition or incoming helicopters, then walked back to his station, his stride slightly less unhurried than before. He didn't like being ignored. More accurately, he didn't like being reminded that he could be ignored, that there were people in his hospital who didn't require his approval to survive his presence. Gunnery Sergeant Vega watched this entire exchange from his hospital bed, his eyes tracking the dynamic with the kind of attention he'd once used to scan rooftops for sniper positions. He was still scanning. Elena was the rooftop now. The day moved in that particular chaos of emergency medicine, moments of absolute boredom followed by minutes of controlled panic, rinse and repeat, all day, every shift. Elena had moved a patient to the trauma bay, started a second for in a kid with acute gastroenteritis, updated charts on 6 different cases, and was helping a 94-year-old woman into a wheelchair when the code came through. Code blue in the main hallway. Cardiac arrest. No pulse. Time is brain, they always said, and brain is life. Elena was already moving, her feet finding the path through the ER with the efficiency of muscle memory that had been built in deserts 8,000 miles away where the only difference between life and death was the time it took to make a decision. The patient was a 62-year-old construction worker, admitted 6 hours ago with chest pain, and he was on the floor now, his body not moving except for the jerking of compressions from the resident who'd reached him first. The resident was competent, probably, but he was panicking. Elena could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the slightly increased compression rate, the way his eyes kept darting to Mercer, waiting for instruction. Elena assessed the scene in 2 seconds. Collapsed lung. The patient's right side wasn't rising with the assisted breaths from the bag valve mask, his O2 sat dropping from 84 to 79 to 71, his color turning the kind of gray-blue that meant metabolic acidosis was already beginning. Tension pneumothorax. The hallway was wrong for this, but the hallway was where he was, and you worked with the reality in front of you, not the reality you preferred. She moved to the crash cart without waiting for permission, her hands already reaching for the needle, 14-gauge angiocath, the kind used for chest decompression, the same needle she'd used on a Marine whose lung had collapsed from an IED fragmentation wound 3 blocks from the combat support hospital in Ramadi. The anatomy didn't change. The urgency didn't change. The technique didn't change. She found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, her fingers reading the ribs like she was reading a map, and drove the needle through the chest wall with a kind of confident precision that made the resident stop compressions and stare. The hiss of air escaping, that sound, was the most beautiful thing in that hallway. O2 sat began climbing. 75. 80. 88. The patient's color shifted from gray-blue back toward something that approximated human. Keep compressions, Elena said, her voice dropping into a register that wasn't a request and wasn't a question. 70 beats per minute. The resident resumed, and the patient began to return. Sinus rhythm appeared on the monitor. Weak, but there. The patient gasped, his body jerking back to consciousness, his eyes wild with the particular terror of having died and returned to life. The hallway had gone completely quiet. No one was moving except Elena and the resident. Dr. Mercer stood at the end of the hallway, his face the color of the walls behind him, which was the color of rage wrapped in professionalism. The patient would need imaging. He would need admittance to the ICU. He would need someone who understood what had just happened to him and why he was still breathing. Elena had given him that. Dr. Mercer was calculating how to punish her for it. Gunnery Sergeant Vega had come down to the hallway for his prescribed post-op ambulation, his physical therapist's hand under his arm, when he'd witnessed the code. He'd watched Elena work and had seen something in her movement, in the angle of her shoulders, in the absolute absence of hesitation that meant she'd done this before. Not in a simulation lab. In the field. His eyes followed her as she documented the procedure, her hand steady, her breathing controlled, her face showing nothing. The physical therapist was trying to move him back to his room, but Vega held his ground, waiting until Elena had finished. When she finally looked up, he caught her eye. He held the gaze for just long enough. Then he asked it, quietly, so only she would hear over the ambient chaos of the ER. "Where do you serve?" The words were casual, but the question underneath them was surgical. She met his eyes once. He saw everything in that single moment, the recognition, the calculation, the decision about whether to confirm or deny. Then she shook her head slightly. No words. Just the shake. Vega understood what silence meant. He'd heard it before. In Kandahar. In the field hospital. In the kind of conversations that never happened in official records. Elena moved past him and returned to her rounds, and Vega knew with absolute certainty that whatever she'd been doing with that needle, whatever technique she'd used to save that man's life, hadn't come from any textbook published after 2010. The Kandahar cut. That was what they'd called it. That was what forward surgical teams called the procedure when you had 90 seconds and no ultrasound and a Marine whose chest was filling with blood. Elena Martinez had just performed it in a hallway at Cedar Creek Medical in front of 17 witnesses. One of those witnesses understood exactly what he'd seen. Gunnery Sergeant Vega understood immediately. He didn't move from his wheelchair as Elena continued down the corridor, but his eyes tracked her movements like he'd just watched someone remove a carefully constructed mask and reveal what had always been underneath. The Kandahar cut. Lateral approach, no landmarks, the kind of precision that only came from practicing medicine under fire when equipment failed and time collapsed into single digits. He said nothing else. Neither did she. But in the hospital's fluorescent glare, something fundamental had shifted. Elena Martinez had just been recognized by someone who knew exactly what recognition meant. Dr. Mercer noticed the interaction from his position near the nurse's station. He didn't know what had passed between them, couldn't know, but he registered the moment as data. A connection. Weakness, possibly, or at minimum, a thread worth pulling. He'd been watching Elena for 3 weeks now, building his case with the methodical precision of someone who understood that direct confrontation accomplished nothing. Direct confrontation created witnesses. Direct confrontation could be contested. But whispered concerns to hospital administrators. Strategic mentions in staff meetings? Those were patterns. Those were documentation. Those were undeniable. The morning after Vega's recognition, Dr. Mercer arrived at Cedar Creek before the 6 a.m. shift change. He carried 2 folders, one containing Elena's recent charts, the other containing nothing but promise. He found Administrator Davidson in the hallway outside her office, holding coffee, checking her phone. "Margaret, do you have a moment?" Mercer's voice carried the perfect tone of reluctant concern, the sound of someone forced to speak about uncomfortable truths. "I've been meaning to discuss some observations about our nursing staff." Davidson looked up from her phone. Mercer was already moving closer, already lowering his voice so only she could hear. This was the technique, never loud enough for witnesses, never accusatory enough to seem like gossip, just one colleague gently alerting another to a potential liability. "It's Elena Martinez," he continued. "The ER nurse. I've noticed some genuinely unorthodox methods creeping into her practice. Yesterday I observed her attempting a procedure that frankly looked like something from a field trauma manual, not protocol. I'm concerned about scope creep. Patient safety, obviously." Davidson's expression shifted. The words patient safety were oxygen to hospital administrators. They activated every insurance protocol, every liability alarm. Mercer could see it working behind her eyes. "Her documentation has also been inconsistent," he added, opening the folder just enough for her to glimpse the tabs. "Gaps in her employment history that I haven't been able to verify through normal channels. I'm not suggesting anything definite, just that it might be worth a conversation with HR due diligence." He closed the folder. He smiled sympathetically. "I may be overreacting. But given what we see in the news these days, credentials that don't check out, backgrounds that don't match the resume, better safe than sued, right?" Davidson nodded slowly, already mentally scheduling HR conversations, already seeing the potential exposure. Mercer excused himself and moved toward the break room. He'd planted the first seed with enough care that it would grow roots without his fingerprints visible on it. The break room at 6:38 a.m. on a Wednesday was Elena's routine, 15 minutes before her shift, coffee and silence, reviewing the day's unit assignments on the posted schedule. Mercer timed his arrival for exactly 6:52. 3 other nurses were already there, Patricia from nights, Sarah who covered pediatrics, and James from the surgical rotation. Comfortable people. The kind who set the tone. Speaking of scope of practice, Mercer said conversationally, pouring himself coffee, "I'm reviewing some recent events for documentation purposes. There's a difference between quick thinking and protocols that exist for a reason." He turned to the group, tone carefully balanced between friendly and professional. When procedures fall into gray areas, it's important that we're all aware of the standard expectations. Incomplete documentation is especially problematic from a liability standpoint. He sipped his coffee. He didn't look at any specific person, which made it perfectly clear he was looking at all of them, specifically Elena, who would arrive in approximately 90 seconds. Hospital administration agrees, he continued. They're being very clear that scope of practice violations, even unintentional ones, have to be addressed systematically. I'm just making sure everyone's aware of the standards. Patricia exchanged a glance with Sarah. James suddenly became very interested in his oatmeal. The message had arrived with crystal clarity. Elena's methods were under scrutiny. Elena's documentation was questionable. Elena was creating liability. Mercer was standing at the sink when Elena entered. He didn't acknowledge her. He simply rinsed his cup and left, leaving the silence to do its work. 3 other nurses in the room, and Elena understood in the space of that quiet greeting that something had shifted. The friendly nod she usually received didn't materialize. Patricia busied herself with retrieving something from her locker. Sarah suddenly remembered she needed to check something in the unit. James picked up his meal and relocated to a table in the corner. Elena poured her coffee. She sat at the table where she'd sat every shift for 2 years. The seat felt different. The air pressure felt different. She raised the cup to her lips and tasted not coffee but confirmation. Isolation was beginning. The next morning, the pattern clarified. Elena entered the break room at 6:45 a.m. 2 nurses were laughing about something from the night shift, easy, familiar laughter. The moment they saw her, the laughter stopped. One picked up her thermos and claimed she'd forgotten something in her locker. The other suddenly remembered a chart she needed to review. Within 90 seconds, Elena was alone at the table, her coffee cooling in front of her, the fluorescent lights buzzing their mechanical drone above her head. She didn't react. Her jaw didn't tighten. Her hand didn't shake. She simply sat, finished her coffee with the same steady pace she would have maintained if the room were full, and then moved to the unit floor. But her eyes registered everything. The way conversation stopped when she entered a corridor. The way her name wasn't mentioned during the morning huddle despite her being assigned to 4 patients. The way charts were pulled for her by the unit clerk without eye contact, just handed over with a nod that looked like something performed by someone afraid of contamination. Mercer observed from his position near the charge nurse's desk. He was building a file now, a documentation of Elena's increasing isolation. Soon he would add appears unable to work cooperatively with staff to the record. Soon he would mention her negative interpersonal dynamics to administration. The patterns were accumulating. The liability narrative was taking shape. By Friday of that week, the isolation had become visible enough that even the patients registered it. Elena moved between rooms with the same precision, the same attentiveness, but the nursing staff moved around her like she was something they'd learned to navigate rather than work alongside. Break rooms emptied when she arrived. Shift handoffs happened without her, information delivered through other nurses rather than directly to her. She was being slowly removed from the informal structures that made hospitals function, the networks of communication and cooperation that existed beneath the formal chain of command. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst came on the following Tuesday when she performed the needle decompression that changed everything. A patient coded in the hallway, tension pneumothorax developing too fast for the trauma bay, the kind of situation that killed people while you waited for procedures and equipment. Elena moved without hesitation. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The hiss of air escaping, the immediate drop in resistance that meant she'd hit the pleural space. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed from 72 to 88% in the space of 4 seconds. The patient's daughter watched the entire sequence, confusion and gratitude mixing across her face. "She just saved my father," the woman said to the nearest staff member. Elena continued to the crash cart, her movements never disrupting, her face presenting nothing but professional focus. But Dr. Mercer had also witnessed the procedure. He'd watched her hands move with absolute certainty through a technique that fell somewhere between training and instinct, the kind of skill that didn't develop in a standard nursing curriculum. And he understood that this moment, this visible, public, undeniable moment of competence, was the threat he'd been building toward addressing. He spent 30 minutes documenting. He spent 40 minutes making a phone call to the credentialing board. And then he walked to the public unit board, the one visible to staff and visitors, and posted a written warning. His voice carried across the ER as he did it, loud enough for the patient's family to hear, loud enough for other staff to stop moving and listen. "This is what happens when nurses forget their scope of practice," he said, tapping the board once, then again, each tap a small violence of public humiliation. "Ms. Martinez, your cowboy medicine might have worked wherever you were before, but here we follow protocols. This is an official written warning for practicing beyond your license." The patient's daughter stared at the interaction, confusion crossing her face. Hadn't that nurse just saved her father's life? Hadn't Dr. Mercer's warning just condemned the action that had kept her father breathing? Elena's hand moved to her next patient's chart. Her pen found the page. Her signature formed itself with the same steady pressure it always had. Her eyes didn't meet anyone's for the rest of the shift, not because she was breaking, not because she was crying or trembling or feeling the weight of public shame, but because she was already 3 steps ahead of the moment, already calculating the implications, already understanding that this was escalation. The shift ended at 7 p.m. Elena drove home through Savannah traffic, her hand steady on the wheel, her breathing controlled. The fluorescent lights of the hospital faded behind her. The isolation would continue. The pattern would deepen. But somewhere in the back of her consciousness, she registered a shift in the timeline. Mercer had moved from whispers to public action. That meant he believed he had enough documentation to follow through. That meant the clock had started on something larger than break room avoidance or administrative gossip. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the darkening car for exactly 2 minutes before opening the door. Her son Diego would be finishing homework in the kitchen. She had the energy for normalcy tonight, for the careful construction of a mother who'd simply had a long shift, who had nothing in her history that needed hiding, who could sit across from her 13-year-old and eat dinner without the truth fracturing the silence. It was a skill she'd perfected over 15 years. The mask fit perfectly. It always had. The intercom crackled at 2:06 a.m. Trauma alert, training accident, Marine General, ETA 6 minutes. Multiple internal injuries, suspected abdominal hemorrhage. Prepare Trauma Bay 1. Elena's hands didn't pause. The force she was placing in a septic patient went in smooth, practiced, her thumb anchoring the catheter at exactly the right angle. 63-year-old woman with a urinary tract infection that had metastasized into bloodstream infection. Treatable. Survivable. Elena had seen worse. She had seen worse at 0400 hours in Ramadi when a convoy took small arms fire and she'd held a Marine's intestines in her hands while waiting for the dust to settle enough for a medevac bird to land. General Reeves. The resident nurse, Marcus, appeared at her shoulder. "That's our commanding general. The one who runs the entire southeastern training operations. Blood type. Already in the system. AB negative. It's rare. We've got 3 units on standby, but they're coming from Charleston." Elena nodded. AB negative. Universal donor compatibility. She knew her own blood type the way a pilot knows their fuel reserve, essential information, survival information. The knowledge lived in her body the way muscle memory lived in her hands. The ER doors burst open and the general arrived on a stretcher, his face the color of old paper, his breathing shallow and fast. His dress uniform was soaked through with blood. One of his legs was bent at an angle that made the orthopedic residents wince in unison. His abdomen was distended, rigid, the telltale sign of internal bleeding that was happening right now, in real time, his blood pooling inside his body cavity with nothing to stop it. Pressure's 84/52 and dropping, the paramedic called out. Airway is patent, responding only to pain. We got 2 large bore lines in the field, started 1 unit at 100 milliliters per minute. Dr. Mercer materialized in trauma bay 1 like he'd been waiting in the walls. His movements were sharp, economical, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos with the precision of a surgeon who had spent 30 years learning to command rooms full of people. Activate massive transfusion protocol. Get me an ultrasound. I need to see where that bleed is coming from. 2 units of O negative while we type and cross for AB negative. Move. The nursing team scattered. Elena moved toward the general's full line, checking the flow, the needle gauge, the tubing. 18 gauge. Good. That would accept rapid transfusion. The first unit of blood was already hanging, gravity-fed, the bag suspended from the forepole like a crimson promise of survival. The ultrasound machine wheeled in and Mercer was already pulling up the general's abdomen, the wand moving across the rigid skin, and there it was, the dark pool inside the peritoneal cavity, blood where there should have been organs, blood that was leaking out of something important. Ruptured spleen, maybe. Liver laceration. The kind of injury that required surgery in the next 40 minutes or the general would bleed out despite every unit of blood Cedar Creek Medical could throw at him. OR is being prepped, someone called out. Neurosurgery is coming in for consult on the head trauma. Can we get a CT or do we go straight to? Straight to surgery, Mercer said. His eyes were bright with the particular focus that came from high-stakes medicine, the kind that looked like hunger if you didn't know better. Get 2 more units up. Push the first one wide open. Elena changed out the bag and reset the infusion rate. The blood flowed faster now, crimson through clear tubing, gravity doing the work, the general's pale skin slowly gaining color, his pressure climbing on the monitor. 84. 86. 90. There. That was better. The second unit of AB negative went in at 2:54 a.m. At 2:58 a.m., the general's blood pressure crashed again. Not gradually. Not a slow decline that gave you time to adjust and compensate. A full collapse. 90 down to 70 in the space of 3 seconds. He's rejecting it, Elena said. Her voice was quiet, lower than normal, the kind of quiet that people instinctively lean toward. Look at his skin. The hives were already rising across his chest, small welts blooming like flowers under dark soil. His breathing was changing too, becoming labored, his oxygen saturation dropping on the monitor as his airway began to swell in response to something in that blood unit. That's impossible, Mercer snapped. It's been type and cross-matched twice. It's AB negative. He's AB negative. The blood is compatible. The blood is correct, Elena said, and now she was moving, her hands already unwrapping a 20-gauge needle from a sterile package, her other hand already pushing up the sleeve of her scrubs. But his immune system is rejecting it anyway. Might be a reagent contamination. Might be cold agglutinin disease. Doesn't matter why. What matters is what we do now. She found her vein at the crook of her elbow with the kind of efficiency that came from having done it dozens of times before, in places where there was no time for doubt, where your hands moved the way they were trained to move and your mind didn't get a vote. The needle went in smooth. Blood flowed into the collection tube, her blood, the kind that could go into anyone, universal donor, the gift that needed no questions asked. Absolutely not, Mercer said. His voice had changed. It was sharp now, edged with something that looked like anger but felt more like fear. Fear of loss of control. We have protocols. We have blood banks. We have? 60 seconds, Elena said. She was already preparing the generals for line with the other hand, her movement synchronized with the precision of something that had been drilled into muscle memory long before this hospital existed. His O2 sat is at 68. He's hypotensive and going lower. His pupils are starting to dilate. She didn't wait for permission. Permission was a luxury item that didn't exist in the moments where people died. She connected her own blood directly to the general's line and watched it flow, watched his vital signs change within seconds, watched the monitor climb as his body accepted what his own immune system had rejected. 90. 95. 100. The breathing eased. The hives began to fade. By 3:02 a.m., General Reeves' blood pressure was stable. 110/70. His oxygen saturation was 98% on a simple nasal cannula. His pupils were reactive. His color was back. Elena disconnected the needle from her own arm and pressed gauze to the puncture wound. The ER staff stared. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they'd been doing it all along, indifferent to the impossibility that had just happened in this small corner of Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah, Georgia at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday. Dr. Mercer's jaw worked silently. His eyes moved from Elena to the general to the monitor to Elena again, tracking something in his mind, calculating, processing, his hand still holding the ultrasound wand like it had become a weight he'd forgotten he was carrying. "Get him to surgery," Mercer said finally. His voice was different now, flatter, stripped of the authority that had filled it moments before. "And someone document that blood transfusion protocol deviation." The nurses moved. The stretcher rolled out of Trauma Bay 1 toward the elevators, toward the operating room, toward a 7-hour surgery that would save his life because he'd made it through the critical window. The window where he would have bled out. The window Elena had held open with her own blood. Over the next 48 hours, Elena worked 16-hour shifts. She should have gone home. She should have rested. Instead, she moved through Cedar Creek Medical like a ghost in scrubs, checking on General Reeves after his surgery, monitoring his labs, adjusting his medications, watching his vital signs climb steadily back toward something that looked like human. Every hour, his numbers improved. Every shift, he was more alert, more stable, more alive. Mercer moved through the hospital in a different way. His phone seemed permanently affixed to his ear. Conversations with hospital administration. Conversations with the credentialing board. Low voices in corners. Strategic whispers. Elena heard fragments. Misrepresented qualifications. Liability concerns. Practicing beyond scope of nursing practice. Field transfusion protocol is battlefield medicine, not hospital medicine. She heard them and she kept walking, kept charting, kept doing the work that nobody was asking her to do anymore. The mask fit perfectly. It always had. The general's vitals climbed like dawn breaking over a desert horizon. 72 hours post-transfusion, his blood pressure held steady at 118/74, his oxygen saturation locked at 97% on room air alone. The surgical team that had been braced for catastrophic organ failure watched instead as his body accepted Elena's blood as if it had been waiting for it all along. The nurses whispered about her efficiency, her instinct, the way she'd known exactly what to do when everyone else froze. Dr. Mercer heard every word. His jaw tightened each time a resident mentioned how she'd moved, how calm she stayed, how the general himself had thanked her by name, Captain Elena, he'd called her, a slip that meant nothing to anyone but carried weight like a stone dropped into still water. Mercer made his first call on a Wednesday morning, his office door locked, his voice precisely modulated. The credentialing board director listened as he outlined his concerns with the surgical precision of someone who'd spent 30 years learning how to dismantle reputations piece by piece. Serious gaps in her employment history, Mercer said. Military service records that don't align with her stated timeline. I'm seeing inconsistencies that concern me from both a competency and liability standpoint. He didn't accuse. Accusation was crude. Instead, he planted questions like seeds in soil already prepared. By that afternoon, the board had flagged her file for full audit. The second call came Wednesday evening, this time to hospital administration. Mercer's voice took on a sympathetic tone, the voice of a doctor reluctant to betray a colleague but bound by duty to patient safety. I've been reviewing her scope of practice, he said. The transfusion protocol she initiated without physician authorization, while it happened to work in this case, sets a dangerous precedent. What if the next time it fails? What if family decides to sue? He let that sit. I'm simply suggesting we verify her qualifications before we face a liability claim that destroys this institution. The hospital lawyer was on the call. That was the moment Mercer knew he'd won. Doubt, once introduced into bureaucratic bloodstream, spreads like infection. Gunnery Sergeant Vega approached Elena on the third day as she was charting in the break room. His wheelchair was still new to him, the precision of his movement still calibrating to his altered body. Question for you, he said, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. What's your blood type? Elena didn't look up from the monitor. Her fingers continued their steady movement across the keyboard. Oh, positive. Hey, Vega said. That's interesting. Because I watched you get cross-typed for times before that general took your blood. AB negative doesn't just show up in O positive. Elena's hands paused for exactly 1 second. Then they resumed their work. Her voice was flat, the voice of someone discussing weather, luck of genetics. Vega studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they understand what silence means. I knew a surgeon once, he said quietly. Worked in a place that didn't officially exist. Combat knife because the instruments were back at a phi base she couldn't reach. Saved more Marines than most operating rooms see in a decade. He rolled himself backward toward the door. That surgeon disappeared after the operation got classified. Officially never existed. Elena's jaw remained steady. Her shoulders didn't move. She didn't blink. I hope she's doing well, Vega said, and left her there with her charts and her silence and the weight of recognition she couldn't acknowledge. The summons to HR came on Thursday morning, delivered in person by a hospital administrator with the kind face of someone delivering bad news they didn't write. Elena read the letter once while sitting in the director's office, her eyes moving across the words with the same efficiency she applied to patient charts. Irregularities in employment history. Unverifiable military service records. Scope of practice concerns. Liability exposure. Dr. Mercer's name appeared twice, each time framed as a concerned colleague rather than a saboteur. The director wasn't unkind. We've sent 3 requests to the Pentagon for your service records, he explained, sliding a folder across the desk. All responses have come back classified or no record found. That's unusual, Ms. Martinez. We need documentation of your qualifications. Elena could have explained that after the operation in Ramadi was sealed, after the forward surgical team was officially dissolved, after the entire command structure was buried under layers of need-to-know clearance, Captain Elena Martinez ceased to exist in any database accessible to civilian institutions. She had been ordered to disappear. Given a new name. Told never to surface. The records didn't exist because she wasn't supposed to exist. But explaining that would require admitting that what she'd done in a combat field hospital could never be verified by any institution that valued its institutional integrity. I understand, Elena said quietly. She turned in her badge without argument, without explanation, without a single question about severance or final paychecks. The director seemed surprised by her acceptance, as if he'd expected negotiation or emotion or some plea to reconsider. She gave him none of these things. The composure that had served her in Ramadi, that had kept her hand steady while monsoon rain fell on a surgical field, that had taught her how to make impossible decisions with no information and no backup, that composure held now, a mask so perfectly fitted that even she sometimes forgot it was there. She drove home in silence. The drive from Cedar Creek Medical to her house in Savannah took 17 minutes. She counted them. The driveway stretched before her like a landing strip. She pulled in at 11:33 a.m. and sat in the car with the engine running for 20 minutes. The radio played a song she didn't register. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10:02, the exact position she'd learned in basic officer training 15 years ago. At 12:07, she turned off the engine. The silence was absolute. She was still in scrubs when Diego found her at the kitchen table an hour later. Her shoulders moved in small, controlled movements, not the dramatic collapse of someone falling apart, but the contained tremor of someone whose body was processing something her mind refused to name. The tears came silently, the way trained soldiers cry when they think no one is watching. "Mom." His voice came from the hallway. He was 13, tall enough now that his eyes were level with hers when he stood. He dropped his backpack and froze. Elena lifted her head. She tried to arrange her face into something that resembled explanation. "I'm home early," she started, but the words fractured. She couldn't explain the termination without explaining why they terminated her. She couldn't explain why without revealing what she'd been. She couldn't reveal what she'd been without putting him in danger. So she sat at the table in her soaked scrubs, her jaw clenched against words she couldn't speak, her shoulders shaking with the effort of staying silent. Diego moved toward her with the careful precision of someone approaching wounded wildlife. He didn't ask questions. He sat beside her and placed his hand on her shoulder, a gesture so simple and so devastatingly adult that it broke something in her that no interrogation ever could. They sat like that for 30 minutes. Neither of them spoke. Outside, Savannah continued its humid afternoon rhythm. Cars passed. A neighbor's lawn mower started up 3 houses down. The world moved forward without knowing that in this kitchen, in this moment, someone had been erased. Elena had survived combat zones, had held dying Marines in her hands, had made decisions that altered lives. She had been trained to function in chaos and crisis and impossible circumstances. But she had no protocol for this, sitting at a kitchen table with her son while everything she'd built dissolved like sugar in rain. By evening, Diego had gone to his room. Elena remained at the table. Her scrubs were beginning to dry. Her phone, silent for 8 hours, wouldn't ring with shift changes or patient updates or the 1,000 small demands of hospital life. The badge was gone. The ID that had granted her access to trauma bays and surgical suites and the controlled chaos where she'd actually belonged had been turned in without ceremony or acknowledgement. She was a nurse without a hospital. A captain without a command. A surgeon without a scalpel. The mask fit perfectly. It always had. But for the first time in 15 years, she had no one to wear it for. The silence in the kitchen was so complete you could hear the refrigerator's compressor kick on and off, a rhythmic mechanical pulse like a heart monitor in a room where someone had just flatlined. Elena sat motionless, her hands folded on the table in front of her, watching the light shift across the wood grain as afternoon tilted toward evening. Tomorrow, Diego would go to school. The day after tomorrow, she would wake without an alarm for the first time in 12 years. The hospital would continue without her. Dr. Mercer would move through those halls with his reputation intact and his malice unexamined. Everything would continue except her. And she had no idea that everything was about to change. The lobby doors of Cedar Creek Medical burst open at 7:51 a.m. Diego Martinez stood in the threshold, 13 years old and trembling not with fear but with the kind of rage that only comes from seeing your mother destroyed by someone who has no idea what he's done. Under his arm, a shadow box. Inside that box, a life story no one at Cedar Creek Medical was supposed to know existed. Mom treats people. His voice cracked across the marble tiles, loud enough to cut through morning admissions chatter. She saves people. And you, he pointed at the administrative staff, at the nurses who'd avoided his mother's eyes for 3 days, at Dr. Mercer standing near the cardiology wing, already sensing this was not a moment he wanted to be part of. You need to see this. All of you. A Marine general sat in the waiting area, post-op day 4, still weak enough that standing required both his hands on the armrests. Still weak enough that he had no business being awake. But something in that boy's voice had cut through the medication fog, and he turned, and he watched as Diego opened the shadow box with both hands like it held something sacred. Because it did. The purple heart lay against navy felt. The ribbon, that distinct purple with white edges, seemed to glow under the fluorescent ceiling lights. But it was the engraving that stopped Gunnery Sergeant Vega's breathing. He'd come down from post-op to see what the commotion was, and now he stood frozen, reading the call sign etched into the medal's back. Overwatch, Vega whispered. Not a question. A recognition. The general's eyes snapped to the shadow box. His face went white. Read that engraving to me, Sergeant. Vega's voice was barely audible. Call sign, Overwatch. For wounds sustained while performing field thoracotomy with a combat knife to save Corporal James Hawthorne. He paused, swallowed hard. Sir, that's my nephew. The general's hands gripped the armrests hard enough to turn his knuckles pale. She gave us 48 hours to say goodbye. He still died, but she bought us time. I held his hand because of Captain Martinez. The lobby had gone completely silent. The kind of silence that happens when people suddenly realize they've been standing next to something they fundamentally misunderstood. Diego reached back into the shadow box. Pulled out the second decoration, the Bronze Star, its ribbon a mixture of bronze and white and red. Read it, the general commanded quietly. Vega leaned closer, his voice steady now in that way Marines' voices become when they're reading something that matters. Bronze Star for Vela. Medical operations under sustained fire in hostile territory. Surgical intervention under combat conditions. For lives saved. Operation designation, Eagle Strike, Ramadi. He looked up. Sir, that's classified. A woman in service dress blues had been sitting 2 chairs over, reading a magazine, since 6 a.m. She stood now, and the quality of her presence changed the air pressure in the room like a weather system had just moved in. Commander Sarah Walsh, Defense Intelligence. She'd been here since yesterday, waiting to see if this boy would have the courage to do what his mother couldn't do herself. Diego's hands moved into the shadow box again. The third decoration caught the light like it was asking for permission to be seen. Navy Cross. The woman standing closest to Diego, a nursing assistant who'd been in the break room 3 days ago when Elena's firing had been announced, who'd stood up and left rather than hear what came next, made a small sound like she'd been punched. The room didn't just go quiet. The room held its breath. Oxygen machines hummed. Ventilators wheezed. The coffee station 6 feet away might as well have been on another continent. Navy Cross, Diego said. His voice wasn't cracking anymore. It was steady as a rifle rest. For extraordinary heroism. Ramadi. Captain Elena Martinez. Codename Overwatch. That's when Dr. Mercer moved. He shoved through the gathered crowd, his white coat billowing like he was still wearing authority like a second skin, his face dark with the kind of fury that comes from watching your careful construction collapse in real time. This is fraudulent, he said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. Those are fabricated documents. Stolen Vela. I don't know where that boy got those. I got them from my mom's locker, Diego said quietly. Where she's kept them for 13 years. Where she kept them while you fired her for saving a general's life. She lied on her application, Mercer continued, pushing forward. She misrepresented her qualifications, her history, her entire. 2 men in dark suits stepped forward from near the main entrance. They'd been there since 6:15 a.m., drinking terrible lobby coffee and waiting for the right moment. FBI. The older one had the kind of face that had arrested people in places that didn't make it into news reports. Dr. Robert Mercer, the agent asked. Mercer's mouth opened. Closed. His jaw worked like he was chewing something poisonous. We've been investigating federal database intrusions, the agent continued, pulling a folder from inside his jacket. The papers inside looked like they had more security clearances than Mercer had years of medical practice. Multiple unauthorized attempts to access classified military records. Requests for fabricated dishonorable discharge documentation. Forged credential verification forms sent to the National Board of Medical Examiners. He held up a printout. Mercer's name, flagged. Multiple times. Each flag a federal offense. Each offense a career crater. You triggered national security alerts, the agent said. Which is why we've been investigating you since Dr. Martinez's termination. He looked at Mercer the way a Marine looks at a target that's already been neutralized. You attempted to interfere with classified military personnel records. That's a felony. The general had been struggling to his feet the whole time. Vega was helping him up now, one hand under his arm, moving with the careful precision of someone who understood post-op fragility. When he was standing, and the man was tall, even weakened, the kind of tall that comes from generations of command, he pointed at the shadow box. "That Purple Heart," he said, his voice rough from pain and medication, "has an engraving. Sergeant, read it again. For everyone." Vega's voice carried across the lobby like a benediction for wounds sustained while performing field thoracotomy with a combat knife to save Corporal James Hawthorne, United States Marine Corps, Ramadi, Operation Eagle Strike, classified. The general looked directly at Dr. Mercer. "That was my nephew. She operated on him in a war zone with a blade and hands that knew exactly what to do. She saved his life for 48 hours. 48 hours that meant everything." His eyes were wet now, but his voice was still iron. "You tried to destroy her. And you didn't know that you were trying to destroy a captain in the United States Marine Corps. You didn't know that you were trying to destroy the woman who held my family's timeline together when it was shattering." Mercer's face had gone the color of old concrete. His hands clenched at his sides. "This is impossible. She was a nurse. She's just a—" "I'm Commander Sarah Walsh," the woman in blues cut in, her voice the kind of calm that comes from having seen worse than a man's career end in a hospital lobby. "Defense Intelligence. I'm here to confirm Captain Martinez's service record." She stepped closer to the shadow box, reading each decoration like she was translating ancient text. "Codename Overwatch. Ramadi, 2009 to 2010. Operation Eagle Strike." She was officially erased from the military record as part of the operation's classification. Walsh looked at the gathered crowd. "That means she wasn't allowed to tell anyone. That means for 13 years, she carried that silence while working as a nurse. That's not a lie. That's sacrifice." The FBI agent pulled handcuffs from his belt. "Dr. Mercer, you're under arrest for federal fraud and attempted interference with classified personnel records. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in federal court." The cuffs clicked into place. Mercer's hands went behind his back. His white coat, the symbol of every privilege he'd ever weaponized, suddenly looked like a costume belonging to someone else. The general, supported by Vega, raised his right hand. His arm trembled with the effort, but he held it steady, fingers straight, hand to temple. A salute. Not casual. Not performative. The kind of salute Marines give to something bigger than themselves. "Captain Martinez," he said, loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "The Marine Corps owes you a debt we can never repay." Commander Walsh added quietly, her voice carrying through the dead silence, "Codename Overwatch." She held the line when no one else could. Dr. Mercer was walked out through those lobby doors 10 minutes later, his hands cuffed behind the white coat he would never wear again. His career ended like a transmission dying mid-highway, sudden and total and irreversible. The crowd parted for him like water around something toxic. Someone was recording on a phone. Someone was crying quietly into their hand. A hospital administrator stood frozen, realizing too late that his credibility had just been compromised by association. Elena arrived at 8:23 a.m., called by a frantic Diego, and stopped in the doorway to see the aftermath. The shadow box was on a table in the center of the lobby. 3 decorations catching the morning light. Her son's face, puffy from crying, finally at peace. The general standing with his hand still against his chest. Nurses and staff and visiting families and administrators all staring at the same impossible thing, the timid nurse they'd dismissed, standing in military medals. The hospital administrator approached Elena like a man walking toward a firing squad. Apologies tumbled out of his mouth. Immediate reinstatement. Full back pay. Her old position or any position she wanted. She could name her terms. The hospital was horrified. There would be an investigation. Legal would be contacting her. Elena looked at the decorations. At her son. At the folded flag still in her locker upstairs, the one she'd carried out of Ramadi when Corporal James Hawthorne didn't, when she was still Captain Martinez instead of just Elena the nurse, when she was still erased by orders she couldn't refuse. "I'll need to think about it," she said. She took Diego's hand and walked out of Cedar Creek Medical into the Savannah morning. The sun was hitting the parking lot at an angle that made the asphalt shine like a runway. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. For the first time in 13 years, Elena's son knew his mother's name. Really knew it. 5 years later, Elena treats a young Marine in Cedar Creek's Trauma Bay, now head of trauma with her rank quietly restored on internal records, her decorations mounted in the office where she makes life-and-death decisions about how to save people who've seen what she's seen. The Marine mentions that he saw her old supervisor driving a medical supply van in Jacksonville, still fighting federal charges. No license to practice, no hospital that would have him. The man's entire life compressed into a van and a slow legal destruction. Elena nods once, processing this without emotion, and returns to her patient. The young Marine's GCS is 6. She's already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead, already becoming the version of herself that doesn't hesitate. Later, alone in her office, she touches the folded flag now mounted on her wall beside her decorations, her fingers tracing the stars. She thinks of Corporal Hawthorne, who died 48 hours after she saved him. She thinks of the others she couldn't save, the one she could, and the teenager who revealed her when she couldn't reveal herself. Her voice is barely a whisper, words only meant for this room. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. Then she returns to the ER, where 3 incoming traumas are already being wheeled through the bay doors, where the work never stops, where the hands that learned to save lives in Ramadi continue saving them in Savannah. The machines hum. The monitors beep. And Captain Elena Martinez, head of trauma at Cedar Creek Medical, moves toward the patients who need her steady hands and her silent strength. If you made it this far, you know that sometimes the most important battles happen in the places we never expect. Subscribe to see more stories of hidden strength, of quiet heroes, of people who carry silence like medals. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true story. The world is full of Overwatch call signs, people quietly saving lives while the rest of us had no idea what we were standing next to.